Good afternoon, class. Mr. Hansen again. Today we're going to talk about multiplication, and we'll look at some basic rules of multiplication and some properties, and then we'll go into division as well. So here's an example I have. Negative 3 times 2. Remember, in algebra we use parentheses to denote multiplication. And the product, the answer for multiplication is called the product. So negative 6 would be an example of a product. Okay, now, why is a negative times a positive negative? Well, one way I could just show you, since we know multiplication is repeated addition, we could say that negative 3 times 2 is two groups of negative 3, and negative 3 plus negative 3 is negative 6. So the first rule, you want to know that if you're multiplying two things that are different signs, one negative, one positive, and it doesn't matter the order, okay, either one of these cases, your answer will always be negative. So negative times a positive is negative, or a positive times a negative is also negative. Okay? So for example, if I have 6/7 times negative 1/2, okay, when we multiply fractions, remember just multiply straight across. But we have a negative times a positive, so the top would be negative 6 over 14 on the bottom. This can be reduced to negative 3/7. Okay? So the question next is, what happens when you have a positive times a positive? Well, if we have a positive times a positive, I think you all already know that it's going to be a positive product. For example, 7 times 4. Okay, this is another way to write multiplication with a dot. 7 times 4 is equal to 28. Okay, you could look at it as 4 groups of 7 or 7 groups of 4. Either way, but you can still see that it's positive. So a positive times a positive is always positive. Okay. Probably the most confusing is a negative times a negative, and that's the last case we're going to look at. So a negative times a negative turns out to be positive. Okay? So for example, negative 3 times negative 4 is going to be 12. Okay, that's just one rule we're going to deal with. Okay? So negative times a negative is positive. Stuff you probably already know, maybe just need a refresher. Okay, let me talk about the idea of the identity, the multiplication identity. Multiplicative identity. Okay? Sorry for the focus there. So what number do you multiply? Can you multiply by any number to keep the same number intact? Okay, if you said 1, you're right. So for example, 3 times 1 is still 3. Okay. 4 times 1 is still 4. A half times 1 is still a half. Okay, so the number that is the multiplicative identity is 1. Just like for addition, 0 was the additive identity. The multiplicative identity is 1. Okay? Real quickly, let's look at division. And I know I'm going fast. We'll hit some of the finer points in class. But let's look at division. Division, the solution of a division problem is called a quotient. Yeah. Let's get the correct spelling, quotient. Okay? So in those word problems where you have to translate a phrase into a numerical expression or an algebraic expression, quotient tells you that it's going to be a division problem. So remember in class I said that there's really only two operations, addition and multiplication. So division is actually disguised multiplication. For example, if I have 3 divided by 4, you could easily write that as 3 times 1/4. Okay? So basically division is multiplying by a fraction. Okay? Let's just look at some examples. Let's say negative 12 divided by 3. We'll just keep it simple. The question is, what's a negative divided by a positive? Well, if we break this up as a multiplication, this could be written as 12 times negative 1/3. And we know that a positive times a negative, we just learned that is a negative. Okay, so it would be negative 4 in this example. Okay. Another example, let's do a negative times a negative. So let's say we had negative 15 over negative 3. Negative divided by negative. Well, if I rewrite this as negative 15 times negative 1/3, you can see a negative times a negative, again, is positive. And by the way, you could put the negative sign down by the 3. I just took this sign and moved it up. So again, 15 divided by 3 is 5. So this would be called our quotient. 5 would be our quotient. Okay? I think that covers the basics. Let's just end with one more example. Well, one last thing. Let's talk about reciprocals. Okay, reciprocals are two numbers that multiply to get 1. Okay, two numbers that multiply to get 1, or have a product of 1. Okay, for example, 2/3 times 3/2. You get 6 over 6, which is 1. Another example, negative 1 times negative 1. Negative 1 is its own reciprocal. That product is 1. So those are reciprocals. How about 7? Let me ask you this. What number do we multiply 7 by to get 1? If you said 1/7, that is correct. Okay? So we'll look at some of these more closer in class. Just a little background for tonight. We will see you tomorrow.